Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. It's round 8 in the Tata Steel Masters. We're over the halfway stage. Remember, it's a 13-round all-play-all tournament. And I'm going to look at the game between Shakhriyar Mamedyarov from Azerbaijan and Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa from India. 16 years old, a real prodigy. He lost in the last round against Magnus Carlsen, and he's got another tough one today. There's a 20-year age gap between these players. Mamedyarov is 36, Praggnanandhaa 16. So Mamedyarov with the white pieces, c4, e5, g3. Well, generally Mamedyarov likes to play the fianchetto with white, sometimes with d4, but here obviously it's in English. c6, looking to play d5 and get a big centre. So Mamedyarov counters with d4. And one can just take here. That's reasonable. e4 is very ambitious, looking to set up this big centre, and black would have a space advantage if he's able to hold this central control. And here Mamedyarov plays a really interesting move. Of course, you know, you can play a normal move here, knight c3. He plays queen a4. Played it really quickly. And this is quite typical of Mamedyarov. You know, he's not afraid to play kind of non-standard positions. This is, well, it's been seen before, but it's an unusual move. So what's the point of this? Well, if black plays d5, it means that white can take. And then, of course, pawn takes pawn, which is the move you want to play, supporting the e-pawn, of course, is impossible because of the pin. So that's one reason behind a4, queen a4. And as a bonus, bishop b4 check isn't possible. This move would speed up black's development and, you know, could be a very useful move. So those are the two ideas behind queen a4. d5 anyway from Praggnanandhaa. Pawn takes pawn, so as I said, pawn takes pawn against the rules of chess. And if queen takes, then of course, you know, white is gaining time, and that's not so great for black. But Pragg had prepared this move, b5, and already, according to my database, we're in new territory. Hasn't been seen before. But you know, I'm sure Mamedyarov was absolutely delighted to see this move, because suddenly, you know, black's position, black's pawn structure is a little bit ragged. He's got a sort of an unusual position on the board, and they can just play chess. You know, Shak doesn't need to worry about being caught out in some kid's theory. You know, it's both players are now playing on their wits, basically. So queen b3. And in my experience, this often happens when you play an unusual move. Your opponent somehow feels that they have to be creative as well. And they often do something a little bit wacky. And that's certainly the case here, b5. So it's actually possible to play queen takes here. And then white could play an endgame. It's a kind of reverse French defence endgame, and then it's not clear whether the pawn on b5 is a strength or a weakness. Or white could play something really quite unusual, queen e3 and then knight c3 and try to target that pawn. But who knows what Shak would have done. Anyway, knight f6 played. So this is interesting. So Pragg is being creative. You know, he's prepared to offer a pawn here. Well, if white wants to take a second one, that's probably rather foolish, but certainly it's you know, sacrificing one pawn. And I think that's reasonable compensation for black. It's a bit like a Milner-Barry gambit reversed, if that makes any sense. And here, because the pawn's on g3 and e3, then these squares are potentially rather weak. So an interesting pawn sacrifice. But after about a 6.5 minute think, Mamedyarov just played bishop g5, and you know, it's a really logical move. The knight is an important piece, giving black some control or influence over these squares, so you know, why not pin basically. And if queen takes d5, of course white can damage those kingside pawns. So after a 23-minute think, Praggnanandhaa played queen a5 check. Knight c3 blocks the check, and then b4, pushing the knight, which went back here, and then knight takes d5. So it's a really unusual position, with both sides have developed their queens very early in the game, and not a lot else. This bishop is slightly out on a limb. Actually, white even has to be careful here because it's in the same line as the queen. And, well, if bishop g2, a normal move, then bishop e6 is rather uncomfortable. The queen is on the same line as the bishop. If it moves, there could be a discovered check. It's a tricky position. So here, Mamedyarov had another big think and played bishop h3. So it's a rather unusual move, but actually this is an excellent move. Obviously white needs to develop, so that's one thing about playing the bishop to h3. But basically it's directed against that move, bishop e6. Bishop takes, knight takes. Knight d7, so Praggnanandhaa developing very quickly. Rook c1. And now there's some pressure here. You see, this is why I think Mamedyarov would have been delighted to see this pawn push b5, b4, even though it's a very unclear position. But somehow black's pawn structure is rather ragged after the advance of the b pawn. So we can see that the c pawn is now backward. h6 pushes the bishop back. Rook c8 defends the c pawn. And now, excellent move from Mamedyarov, f3. So he's starting to open the position, even while his king's still in the middle. But actually, he only needs one move to castle kingside, and black needs two moves. You have to move the bishop and then castles kingside. So knight f6 defends this pawn. Knight f2, more pressure on this pawn. So finally, pawn takes pawn, and here's the idea that Mamedyarov just wants to crack straight on and push the knight on d5 out of the way. He's not even bothering recapturing that pawn. So the knight has to retreat, and now again doesn't bother taking the pawn, he just castles kingside. So it's a big centre, he's pushed these knights, or this knight, out of the way. Bishop e7, knight e3, knight comes off the back rank and starts to look at that fantastic f5 square. I always repeat what Garry Kasparov said about a knight on f5. Knight on f5, Garry Kasparov said it's his favourite attacking piece. When black has castled kingside, knight on f5 looks at so many sensitive squares around the king. Even when the king's in the middle, it's pretty good on f5 as well. Queen a4. So Pragg, understandably, would very much like to exchange queens, which white can do now, actually. But queen d3 played instead by Mamedyarov, and you know, if black were to castle here, now I should say he did not castle, but let's just have a quick look at what happens. Castles, knight to f5, hitting the bishop. Okay, let's push that knight on f6 away. Okay, b3, push the queen away. Queen takes, and now queen g4. You can see that this is a really, really powerful combination. Mate threatened. One of these pieces, knight or bishop, could take on h6. this is already highly unpleasant for black. And don't forget, there's a second knight that might enter the attack as well. So after queen d3, that's the move just played. Now instead of castling kingside, queen b5 played. So Pragg recognises the danger. And Mamedyarov exchanges queens and exchanges on c8. Well, with the knight on c8, that means it's going to be hard for black to bring that rook over. e5 pushes the knight back. So white's centre looking absolutely fantastic. And here there are several very attractive continuations for white. Knight e4 is possible. Rook c1 is possible. But knight f5, again that move. Hitting the pawn, well, hitting some very sensitive spots. g6 hits the knight. Now rook c1. It's interesting how Shak isn't bothering to come back to take that pawn, which he could have done in several variations, but instead he just wants the initiative. He is so dangerous with the initiative. So rook takes knight threatened, knight b6, knight exchanges for the bishop, and bishop b4. So let me see, the material is still even, actually. It's even. But this rook is in the corner and white has a tremendous initiative. Knight bd5. And here, well, Shak selects a very clean way of playing. You don't have to play like this. You could, for example, just move the bishop here to perhaps to d6, c5. But he sees a very clear way forward. Bishop takes knight and knight e4. So in playing like this, he's got his rook on the open file. He's got his knight in a tremendous position. And if the king can just step up and take the pawn, then he'll be a pawn up and with excellent pieces, and that should just be a win. So Pragg is fighting for his life here. And, well, he played g5 in order to support that pawn. Could have played f6, that's possible. I mean, it's an unpleasant position, but maybe f6 is a way of just trying to fight back against that centre. Anyway, let's see what happened. g5. He played f6 now, but it was too little too late. Rook c5 hits the knight, hits the pawn. Now f5, and the knight came back. Rook d8 supports the knight. Knight takes f3. So now Mamedyarov is a clear pawn up. So it's that famed matter of technique. Can he put it away? King f2. Okay, first of all, let's just bring the king into the middle. That's important. The rook just sits on the open file, so black, for the moment, has no counterplay. Knight b6. Rook c6. Excellent move. So you can see that looks at the pawn here and keeps the king in a poor position. Rook c8. So in these positions, basically, you want to try and control play when you're a pawn up. You don't want to go on adventures. So it's possible that rook takes pawn here is a good move, but suddenly it gets a bit messy after the check and maybe taking a pawn and that knight can fly in. Who knows? Much better just to exchange. Keeps white a clear pawn up. Now black has potential for counterplay. So, you know, white still has to be careful. Nevertheless, it's a clear extra pawn. Now you've got to put it away, and this next move is excellent. This reminds me of a famous game between Botvinnik and Alekhine. These pawns are strong. White needs to break them up. You know, it's clear that these pawns won't just go through on their own. So h4, excellent move, and this breaks these pawns. Black can't prevent them being split in some way. So if pawn takes pawn, knight takes, you can see they're now both isolated. The knight hits here, and knight g6 would be excellent, followed by knight f4. The king would have to go back, and white is in complete control with this pawn coming forward. So Praggnanandhaa pushed, but now notice there's a beautiful square there for the knight. So knight e1, knight b6, and knight g2, and that knight can come to f4 or e3, depending on how black plays. Knight a4 played. Well, in this case, Mamedyarov goes for knight e3, and we'll see there's good reason for this. So this pawn is attacked. If king e6, knight c4 is a beautiful move, because you can see the knight here actually has no good squares now, and black is just utterly lost. So the knight can't move here, can't move to any of those squares. King d3, and again another nice move. You don't need to protect the knight with b3, that would allow the knight back in, but king e3 is beautiful. Just a delicate step, guarding the d4 pawn, and black actually just has to retreat here. There's really nothing better. If king takes knight, of course, b3 check. Forks king and knight. Winning for white. Okay, let's come back. So instead of defending the pawn, knight takes b2, and now the knight just crashed through and took a couple of pawns. So now Mamedyarov is, let me see, 2 pawns up. And he scoops another one. Okay, Pragg scoops that one, but yeah, 2 extra pawns, and these pawns are rolling home. The game ended here. So let's just see exactly why Praggnanandhaa resigned. Let's see, knight takes pawn. You can push on. Now e6, one of those pawns is going through. Or knight g5, h6. Okay, so the white king stops these pawns, and then knight f6, and then h7, and well, little by little, those 4 pawns are going to advance. So smooth technique from Mamedyarov, and just generally, I really like the way he plays. You know, he's an unusual player, very aggressive. He loves the initiative. And very good in these kind of non-standard positions. If you remember, well, that victory actually puts Mamedyarov in the lead. Let me just check the standings. So 2 players on 5.5 out of 8. Carlsen and Mamedyarov sharing the lead. Then Giri and Vidit on 5 out of 8, just a half point behind. So Carlsen could only draw against Sam Shankland. And yeah, if we look on the live list, Mamedyarov is now 5th in the world. If you remember a couple of years ago, 2018 was his Annus Mirabilis, where he got to number 2 in the world, and he was rated well over 2800. I think 2820 was his top rating. So we know that Mamedyarov is a very dangerous player. In fact, in 2018, he won the Biel Grandmaster Tournament ahead of Magnus Carlsen. And I remember there was a big showdown in there. I think it was the penultimate round where Mamedyarov convincingly defeated Carlsen. So Carlsen has his work cut out to win this tournament, and Mamedyarov is looking good at the moment. Now, pairings for the next round, round 9. It's the big one. Magnus Carlsen has white against Shakhriyar Mamedyarov. So that's the one to watch. I think there's, hang on, yeah, tomorrow's a free day. Monday's a free day invite. So I'll see you back on Tuesday. Thanks for watching.